The Wild West was a land where courage and chaos walked hand in hand. Out on the frontier, law was written in lead, and the fastest draw decided who lived to see another sunrise. Across the plains and border towns, a handful of men stood apart, gunfighters whose names still echo through history, for one reason: they were the deadliest of them all. In this countdown, we're revealing 15 of the most feared and most formidable gunslingers to ever walk the American frontier. Men whose reputations were built not on legend, but on cold, recorded fact. Each one left behind a trail of stories so violent, so unbelievable, you'll wonder how any of them were ever real. Subscribe so you don't miss the next tale from the wild frontier. And tell us in the comments which gunslinger you think would have stood their ground the longest. Number 15, Bill Doolin. He was born William Marion Doolin in 1858 in Johnson County, Arkansas, the son of a farmer and Civil War veteran. By his early 20s, he'd followed the cattle trails west, working as a ranch hand across the Indian Territory. But Doolin's quiet life didn't last. In 1891, he joined the Dalton Gang, one of the most feared outlaw bands in the frontier. He took part in robberies across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, including the 1892 Coffeyville Raid, the disastrous gun battle that left 4 of the Dalton brothers dead. Doolin barely escaped. Within months, he founded his own crew, the Wild Bunch, sometimes called the Doolin-Dalton Gang, a loose circle of gunmen that included names like Bitter Creek Newcomb, Tulsa Jack Blake, and Dynamite Dick Clifton. Between 1892 and 1895, they robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches from Arkansas to New Mexico, netting thousands of dollars and killing several lawmen in the process. The U.S. Marshals made him priority number 1. Deputy Marshal Heck Thomas led the manhunt that chased Doolin for years. He was captured once in 1896, but broke out of jail with 12 other prisoners, one of the boldest escapes in Oklahoma Territory history. His freedom was short. On August 24, 1896, Thomas cornered him near Lawson, Oklahoma. When Doolin refused to surrender, Thomas fired a shotgun blast that ended his life instantly. His body was put on public display in Guthrie, where photographers sold postcards of the dead outlaw for 25 cents apiece. Bill Doolin's death marked the fall of the last great organized outlaw gang of the American frontier, and closed the final chapter on the Wild West's age of the gunslinger. Number 14, Buckshot Roberts. He wasn't a famous outlaw or a celebrated lawman, just a tough, stubborn frontiersman who refused to back down. Born Andrew L. Roberts around 1841, most records trace him to the rugged plains of Texas before he drifted into the New Mexico Territory. He was a former buffalo hunter and soldier who'd seen enough violence to know when to pull a trigger and when to stand his ground. In April 1878, Roberts found himself tangled in the middle of the Lincoln County War, a bitter feud between rival cattle factions that had already claimed several lives. One side was led by wealthy merchant Lawrence Murphy and Sheriff William Brady, the other by John Tunstall, whose young ranch hands included a man who would soon become legend, Billy the Kid. Roberts wasn't part of either side. He'd sold horses to Tunstall's crew but wanted no part in their war. Unfortunately, the regulators, Billy the Kid's group, believed Roberts had joined their enemies. When they rode out to arrest him at his cabin near Blazer's Mill, they didn't expect resistance, but Roberts was ready. When they demanded his surrender, he refused, and a gunfight erupted that would become one of the bloodiest single clashes of the Lincoln County War. Armed with a Springfield rifle, Roberts took cover behind a woodpile and shot Billy the Kid through the arm, then killed Regulator Dick Brewer with a single bullet to the head. Several others were wounded before Roberts himself was struck in the stomach. Gravely injured, he held his ground until the Regulators retreated. The next day, Buckshot Roberts died from his wound, but not before killing the man sent to arrest him and proving that even one determined fighter could stand off an entire posse. His grave still lies at Blazer's Mill, New Mexico, marked by a simple wooden cross. Buckshot Roberts didn't live long enough to become a legend, but in one desperate gunfight, he became one of the most respected men to ever stand behind a rifle on the frontier. Number 13, John Selman. He lived on both sides of the law, a man who wore a badge by day and broke it by night. Born John Henry Selman in 1839 in Texas, he served as a soldier in the Confederate Army before turning to a career as a lawman in some of the most dangerous border towns in the West. But Selman's reputation was complicated. As a deputy and later constable, he was known for his steady hand and quick draw, yet many claimed he used those same skills for robbery and intimidation when the law wasn't looking. After being accused of cattle rustling in the early 1870s, he fled Texas with a small band of outlaws, calling themselves Selman Scouts. They raided across the Rio Grande until Mexican authorities drove them out, and Selman eventually resurfaced in El Paso, a city that seemed to draw every kind of gunman the frontier could offer. There, he switched sides again, putting the badge back on and working as a constable under Marshal George Scarborough. By the mid-1890s, Selman was pushing 50, his reputation fading, until one night put his name in every newspaper west of the Mississippi. On August 19, 1895, inside the Acme Saloon in El Paso, Selman confronted one of the deadliest men alive, John Wesley Hardin. Accounts differ on what started it. Some say it was over a woman. Others claim Selman wanted revenge for an earlier arrest. But what's clear is this. As Hardin leaned over the bar, Selman drew his revolver and shot him in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Selman was arrested, charged with murder, and released on bond. While awaiting retrial the following year, his own story ended the same way so many of his kind did. On April 6, 1896, he was shot and killed during a dispute with U.S. Marshal Scarborough, the very man he'd once served beside. In the end, John Selman became both the man who ended John Wesley Hardin and another name on the long list of Wild West gunmen who lived and died by the gun. Number 12, Jim Taylor. Jim Taylor wasn't born into legend, he was born into war. He was born into one of the bloodiest family feuds in Texas history. James Taylor, better known as Killer Jim Taylor, came from the hard-edged frontier of DeWitt County, Texas, where the Taylor-Sutton feud turned neighbor against neighbor for more than a decade. The feud began in the 1860s when post-Civil War rivalries between Union-sympathizing Suttons and Confederate-leaning Taylors boiled over into open warfare. By the 1870s, the fighting had claimed dozens of lives, and Jim Taylor was at the center of it. Taylor's cousin, John Wesley Hardin, had already become infamous across the West, and Jim followed close behind. Known for his unpredictable temper and deadly accuracy, Taylor quickly earned his nickname. Contemporary accounts credit him with at least 10 confirmed killings, most tied directly to the feud. His most notorious act came in 1873 when he gunned down Bill Sutton, leader of the opposing family, at a steamship landing in Indianola, Texas. Taylor ambushed Sutton and Gabriel Slaughter, killing both men before fleeing the scene. Witnesses described the shooting as swift and merciless, over in seconds. That single moment effectively ended the Taylor-Sutton feud, but it made Jim Taylor a wanted man across Texas. He spent the next several years on the run, protected by sympathizers and friends of the Taylor clan. Unlike many gunfighters of his era, Taylor didn't die in a famous showdown or a courtroom gallows. His exact fate remains uncertain. Some reports say he was shot dead in a revenge ambush, others that he slipped quietly across the Mexican border and disappeared. What's certain is this: Jim Taylor was no myth. He was a real product of frontier vengeance, a man raised in violence who carried on the bloodline of one of the West's most ruthless families. Number 11, Bat Masterson. Dodge City had a way of making legends, and William Barclay, Bat Masterson, was one of the few to live long enough to see his own. Born in 1853 in Quebec, Canada, he moved south with his family and grew up on the Kansas frontier, a place that demanded courage and a steady trigger finger. By his 20s, Masterson was serving as a U.S. Army scout and buffalo hunter, often alongside another future legend, Wyatt Earp. His reputation for coolness under fire earned him a deputy marshal's badge in Dodge City, a cattle town where tempers and revolvers ran equally hot. In 1876, he fought in the Battle of Adobe Walls, where just 29 frontiersmen held off hundreds of Comanche warriors, a feat that cemented his image as a man who never rattled under pressure. As sheriff of Ford County, he quickly proved he was more than just a good shot. He enforced the law with calculated precision, preferring to wound rather than kill whenever possible, a rare restraint in a violent age. Still, when push came to shove, Masterson never hesitated. He was involved in at least 3 confirmed gunfights, including the famous Royal Gorge Railroad dispute in Colorado and the Dodge City War of 1883. By the time the smoke cleared, Bat had traded his 6-shooter for a pen. He became a sports writer and journalist in New York City, chronicling the very kind of men he'd once faced down on the frontier. When he died at his desk in 1921, typewriter at his fingertips, Bat Masterson had outlived nearly every other gunfighter of his generation, a man who'd walked out of the Wild West and into history without ever looking back. Number 10. Dallas Staudenmeier. El Paso was one of the most dangerous towns on the frontier, and for a short, violent stretch in the early 1880s, Dallas Staudenmeier was the only thing keeping it from tearing itself apart. Born in 1845 in Alabama, Staudenmeier enlisted in the Confederate Army at just 15 years old, seeing combat in the Civil War before heading west. Tall, well-dressed, and a deadly shot with either hand, he had the presence of a man you didn't cross twice. By 1881, El Paso had become a border powder keg of saloons, smuggling, and revenge killings. On April 14th of that year, Staudenmeier had been marshal for less than a week when the town exploded into what newspapers called the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight. It began when a local constable, Gus Kremkow, was shot by a drunk named John Hale during an argument. Staudenmeier heard the shot, burst from a nearby restaurant with his pistols drawn, and opened fire. His first bullet went wild and killed a bystander. The next 2 hit Hale and his friend George Campbell, both dead before they hit the dirt. Kremkow, mortally wounded, fired one last round that struck Campbell again as he fell. When the smoke cleared, 4 men were dead in under 5 seconds, and Staudenmeier's name was stamped into frontier history. Over the next year, he killed at least 6 more men in gunfights while wearing the marshal's badge, bringing a brutal order to El Paso's streets, but making enemies everywhere he went. On September 18, 1882, one of those enemies, James Manning, ambushed him outside a saloon and shot him twice. Staudenmeier drew his pistol and returned fire, but a second bullet caught him in the head. He died where he fell, another marshal gone in a town that devoured them. Dallas Staudenmeier's career lasted barely 18 months, yet in that short time he carved one of the bloodiest reputations in Texas law enforcement history. The man who brought peace to El Paso through the barrel of a gun. Halfway through the countdown, and the legends are only getting deadlier. If you've made it this far, you're built for the frontier. Steady nerves, steady aim. Let's see if you'd have lasted a day against the next one. Number 9, King Fisher. Before he became a respected lawman, John King Fisher was one of the most feared outlaws ever to ride the South Texas brush country. Born in 1854 near Seguin, Texas, Fisher grew up in a region ruled by cattle theft, smuggling, and constant violence along the Mexican border, a place where survival meant learning to fight fast. By his early 20s, he was leading a gang of horse and cattle thieves operating out of a camp on the Nueces River. He dressed like a peacock, bright vests, silver spurs, and twin ivory-handled Colts, and enforced his own kind of order in the Badlands between Eagle Pass and Uvalde. Witnesses claimed he killed at least a dozen men during those years, though most of the killings were in fights with rival rustlers and bandits, not innocent settlers. In 1876, he was captured and sent to Huntsville prison, but after serving 2 years, he surprised everyone by trying to turn his life around. He returned home, married Sarah Vivian, and was soon appointed deputy sheriff of Uvalde County, proving he could live on the other side of the law. Locals said that when King Fisher wore a badge, crime in Uvalde dropped to almost nothing. No one dared test him, but the frontier never forgot. On the night of March 11, 1884, Fisher visited a San Antonio saloon with Ben Thompson, another notorious gunfighter. Inside the vaudeville theater, a group of Thompson's old enemies ambushed them from a balcony. Fisher barely had time to draw. Both men were cut down in a hail of gunfire. King Fisher's body was buried in Uvalde, his twin pistols laid beside him. He was a man who crossed every line the frontier drew: outlaw, sheriff, killer, and peacekeeper. And in death, he became proof that in the Wild West, redemption never came easy. Number 8, Tom Horn. Few men blurred the line between lawman and killer like Tom Horn, scout, detective, gun for hire, and one of the most feared marksmen the frontier ever produced. Born Thomas Horn Jr. in 1860 in Missouri, he ran away from home at 16 and headed west, finding work as a cavalry scout during the Apache Wars. He helped track down Geronimo, serving under legendary frontiersman Al Sieber, and quickly built a reputation for calm precision under pressure. By the 1880s, Horn was working for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, chasing train robbers and rustlers across Wyoming, Colorado, and Arizona. His methods were ruthless, efficient, quiet, and often deadly. Pinkerton records show he killed multiple outlaws during arrests, though the agency often downplayed it to avoid scandal. When the Wyoming cattle wars erupted in the 1890s, wealthy ranchers hired Horn as a freelance range detective. His job: eliminate cattle rustlers by any means necessary. Horn never admitted how many men he killed, but witnesses later claimed he bragged of shooting at least 17 rustlers from long range with his Winchester rifle. His downfall came in 1901 when 14-year-old Willie Nickel was shot near Iron Mountain, Wyoming. Horn was accused of the murder after allegedly confessing while drunk to a deputy marshal, a confession many historians believe was fabricated or coerced. Despite weak evidence, the court convicted him more for his bloody reputation than the crime itself. On November 20th, 1903, Tom Horn was hanged in Cheyenne, maintaining his innocence to the very end. His last words were calm and defiant. "Ain't losing my nerve, boys." This is the first time I ever was strung up. Whether he was a hero, a murderer, or something in between, Tom Horn remains one of the most debated figures in Western history, a man who lived by his rifle and died by his reputation. Number 7, Ben Thompson. Few men in the Old West were as respected or as feared as Ben Thompson, a gunfighter whose temper was as quick as his aim. Born in 1843 in Nottingham, England, he emigrated with his family to Austin, Texas, at age 10. By his teens, he was already a crack shot and a gambler, traits that would define the rest of his life. When the Civil War broke out, Thompson joined the Confederate Army, serving until 1865. Afterward, he drifted through Mexico, where he fought as a mercenary and learned the brutal efficiency that would make him one of the most dangerous men in the Southwest. By the 1870s, he was back in Texas, dealing cards in saloons and fighting duels over everything from money to pride. He killed at least 8 men, though historians believe the number may have been higher. Despite his violent streak, even his enemies admitted he was fair. Thompson never drew first, but once the shooting started, he never missed. In 1881, he became City Marshal of Austin, turning one of Texas's roughest towns into a place where even the worst cowboys thought twice before reaching for a pistol. But Thompson's reputation as both a lawman and gambler kept him on a razor's edge, half respected, half despised. His final gunfight came on March 11, 1884, when he visited San Antonio with his friend King Fisher to see a show at the Vaudeville Theater. Inside waited men who wanted revenge, allies of Jack Harris, a saloon owner Thompson had killed 2 years earlier in self-defense. As Thompson and Fisher sat in the theater box, the lights went out. Gunfire erupted from the balcony. Both men were cut down instantly. Ben Thompson's funeral drew hundreds, from judges to outlaws, all paying respects to a man who lived by his own code. Never start a fight, but always finish it. Who do you think will take the top spot? Let's find out. Number 6, Deacon Jim Miller. He looked like a preacher, dressed like a banker, and killed like a professional. James Brown Miller, better known as Deacon Jim, was one of the most cold-blooded assassins in Western history, a man who blended piety with murder in a way that unsettled even hardened gunmen. Born in 1866 in Van Buren, Arkansas, Miller grew up in Texas, where violence came early. At age 8, he witnessed his parents' murder. By age 23, he was accused of killing his own brother-in-law with a shotgun blast and was acquitted for lack of evidence. It was the start of a lifetime pattern: kill, deny, walk free. Unlike most gunfighters who shot in the open, Miller preferred the shadows. He earned his nickname Deacon because he never smoked, drank, or cursed, and attended church every Sunday, even while taking murder contracts during the week. His fees ranged from $150 to $2,000 per killing, depending on the target. Miller's weapon of choice was a 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun, often fired at close range. He wore a steel breastplate under his black frock coat, an early form of body armor that saved his life more than once. He is linked to at least 14 verified murders, including that of former Deputy U.S. Marshal A.A. Gus Bobbitt, shot outside his Oklahoma home in 1909. But this time, the Frontier's patience had run out. Before a trial could begin, a mob of nearly 50 townsmen stormed the jail in Ada, Oklahoma, dragged Miller and 3 accomplices to an empty stable, and slipped nooses around their necks. Calm as ever, Miller handed his wedding ring to a friend and made one final request: "Let her rip." He stepped off the box himself, ending a life spent killing for faith, for money, and for the quiet thrill of it. Photographs of his hanging sold across the territory, a grim reminder that even a man of God could be the devil in disguise. Number 5, Luke Short. He wasn't the loudest man in the saloon, but when trouble started, he was always the last one standing. Luke Short was a gambler, gunfighter, and lawman whose reputation stretched from Dodge City to Fort Worth, earning him a place among the West's most dangerous men. Born in 1854 in Polk County, Arkansas, Short grew up on the Kansas plains and learned to shoot early. By his 20s, he'd worked as a scout for the U.S. Army, then drifted into gambling halls across the frontier, where quick wits and a quicker draw kept him alive. He first gained fame in 1876 when he survived a brutal knife fight in Ogallala, Nebraska, leaving his attacker dead. But it was in Dodge City, Kansas, the frontier's most volatile town, where Short's legend truly took shape. Working alongside Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp, he served as a deputy marshal and enforcer in the notorious Long Branch Saloon. Short's sense of loyalty was fierce. When local officials tried to shut down the saloon in 1883, he called in old allies like Earp and Masterson, leading to the standoff now known as the Dodge City War. It ended without bloodshed, a rare moment of restraint in a time when guns usually settled arguments. Still, Short's career was marked by violence. He fought in at least 3 documented gunfights, including the 1887 shootout with Jim Courtright in Fort Worth. Courtright, a former marshal turned extortionist, challenged Short in front of witnesses. when Courtwright's pistol snagged in his holster, Short fired first, 2 shots to the chest and 1 to the head, killing him instantly. The crowd scattered. Short calmly reloaded, holstered his weapon, and walked away. By then, his name had become synonymous with nerve and precision, a man who didn't start fights, but finished them with absolute finality. Luke Short died in 1893, likely from a lingering illness, not a gun. But on the frontier, few deaths surprised more people. He'd lived long enough to become what most gunfighters never did, a legend who died in bed. Number 4, Clay Allison. If ever there was a man who embodied the chaos of the frontier, it was Clay Allison. Charming, fearless, unpredictable, and utterly deadly. Born Robert Clay Allison in 1840 in Tennessee, he served as a Confederate cavalryman during the Civil War, until a head injury left him prone to violent outbursts, something historians believe shaped his volatile temperament for the rest of his life. After the war, he drifted west to New Mexico, settling near Cimarron as a rancher. But trouble seemed to follow him everywhere. Allison's name first hit headlines after he killed a man named Charles Kennedy, a suspected serial murderer, in 1870. When Kennedy confessed to killing travelers for their belongings, Allison and a group of locals stormed the jail, dragged him out, and executed him on the spot, a vigilante act that made Clay a hero to some and a menace to others. From then on, his reputation only grew. He fought duels across Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico. At least 15 men are believed to have died by his gun, though the exact number is uncertain. His most famous encounter came with outlaw Chunk Colbert, who invited him to dinner in a deceptive peace offering. After the meal, Colbert drew his revolver under the table, and Allison shot him dead before he could fire. When asked later why he'd eaten with a man who wanted to kill him, Allison simply said, "I didn't want to send him to hell on an empty stomach." Despite his reputation for sudden violence, those who knew him described him as polite, loyal, and generous when sober, though whiskey often changed that. By 1887, he had married and tried to live a quieter life, running cattle near Pecos, Texas. But fate had other plans. While hauling supplies one day, his wagon hit a rut, and Allison fell beneath the wheels, breaking his neck. His tombstone reads, "Clay Allison, gentleman, gunfighter." He never killed a man who did not need killing. And in the end, that might be the truest summary of his life. Part killer, part folk hero, and one of the most unpredictable men ever to wear a gun belt. Number 3, Billy the Kid. He was barely old enough to shave, yet his name still echoes louder than almost any gunman of the American frontier. Born Henry McCarty, later calling himself William H. Bonney, in 1859 in New York City, the world would come to know him as Billy the Kid, the smiling outlaw who moved faster than his shadow. Orphaned young, he drifted west, surviving by his wits and a revolver. By the time he reached New Mexico territory, he was already living on the edge, stealing horses, running with drifters, and searching for somewhere to belong. That place turned out to be the ranch of John Tunstall, a British cattleman whose murder in 1878 set off the Lincoln County War, one of the bloodiest feuds in frontier history. When Tunstall's rivals ambushed and killed him, Billy and the other ranch hands formed a vigilante group called the Regulators, swearing revenge. In the months that followed, Billy fought in at least 4 gun battles, killing Sheriff William Brady and several of Tunstall's assassins. Newspapers turned him into a folk hero, painting him as a fearless young rebel who outsmarted corrupt lawmen. But the truth was simpler. He was a survivor in a lawless world. He once told a reporter, "I never killed anyone who didn't try to kill me first." Still, that didn't save him. After escaping jail twice and killing 2 deputies in the process, Billy was finally tracked down by Sheriff Pat Garrett. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett found him hiding in a friend's home near Fort Sumner. when Billy stepped into the darkened room and asked, "Who is?" "Who is it?" Garrett fired, hitting him in the chest. Billy the Kid was dead at just 21 years old. He had 8 confirmed kills, not the 21 legends claim, but his legend grew far beyond the numbers. To this day, no other gunfighter's smile has cast a longer shadow across the Wild West. Number 2, John Wesley Hardin. He called himself a peaceable man, but history remembers him as the deadliest gunfighter who ever lived. Born in 1853 in Bonham, Texas, John Wesley Hardin was the son of a Methodist preacher, and by age 15, he was already a killer. His first recorded shooting came after a schoolyard fight with an emancipated man named Mage. When Mage attacked him later with a stick, Hardin shot him dead. That moment set the tone for the rest of his life. Fleeing arrest, he killed 3 Texas state policemen in an ambush soon after, beginning a career of violence that would leave at least 27 men confirmed dead and possibly more than 40, according to court testimony and Hardin's own writings. Hardin rode across Texas, Kansas, and Louisiana, gambling, rustling cattle, and fighting duels wherever he went. He once killed a man for snoring too loudly in the next hotel room. Another time, he shot a marshal in the head during a poker game in Abilene, the same town where he befriended Wild Bill Hickok. Hickok reportedly warned him to leave town before they ended up on opposite sides of the same gunfight. By 1877, Hardin's luck ran out. A team of Texas Rangers under John B. Armstrong caught him aboard a train near Pensacola, Florida, after a shootout that left 1 Ranger dead. Hardin was brought back to Texas, tried for murder, and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Behind bars, he studied law, found religion, and after his 1894 parole, began practicing as an attorney in El Paso, claiming he had changed. But old habits die hard. Within a year, he was feuding again, this time over a woman. On the night of August 19, 1895, while playing dice in the Acme Saloon, Constable John Selman walked up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. The man who once bragged about outdrawing dozens of enemies never saw the final bullet coming. John Wesley Hardin lived fast, killed often, and died exactly as he lived, without a chance to draw. Number 1, Wild Bill Hickok. He was the man every gunslinger wanted to be: tall, calm, and impossibly fast. Born James Butler Hickok in 1837 in Homer, Illinois, the world would come to know him as Wild Bill, the prototype for every gunfighter who followed. Hickok started his frontier life as a wagon driver on the Santa Fe Trail, then served as a Union scout and spy during the Civil War, earning recognition for his bravery under fire. But it was what came after that made him a legend. In 1865, in Springfield, Missouri, Hickok faced gambler Davis Tutt in what is widely considered the first documented quick-draw duel in the American West. The 2 men had quarreled over a debt. Standing 75 yards apart, they drew their pistols and fired once each. Tutt fell dead, Hickok's bullet through his heart. That single shot transformed him overnight from local lawman to national icon. Over the next decade, Hickok served as marshal in Hays City and Abilene, Kansas, taming cattle towns filled with armed drifters and drunken cowboys. He was known for his icy composure. Witnesses said he could hit a playing card dead center at 50 yards and never drew first unless he had to. Historical records credit him with at least 6 confirmed kills, though some accounts list as many as a dozen. But fame and eyesight both began to fail him. By the 1870s, years of gunsmoke and exhaustion had dulled his once perfect aim. He drifted into Deadwood, Dakota Territory, joining a poker game in Nuttall and Mann's Saloon on August 2, 1876. As he sat with his back to the door, a mistake he never made, drifter Jack McCall stepped behind him and shot him in the back of the head. Hickok died instantly, his hand holding a pair of black aces and eights, forever remembered as the dead man's hand. He left behind no fortune, no descendants, only a legend. A man who didn't just survive the Wild West, but defined it. Wild Bill Hickok, the name that turned gunfighting into myth. 15 names, 15 lives lived on the edge of a trigger. Some were outlaws, some wore badges. But every one of them helped shape the legend of the Wild West, a world where law and chaos rode side by side, and the only thing faster than a man's draw was his reputation. What's most remarkable is how real they all were. Behind every tall tale and dime novel, exaggeration stood a flesh and blood gunfighter who bled, feared, and fought just to stay alive. They weren't movie heroes. They were products of a time when justice came down to who was willing to shoot first and think later. And while their stories have grown into legend, the truth is even harder than the myth. Because in the Old West, the line between good and evil wasn't drawn in ink, it was carved into the dust with gun smoke. So, which one of these gunslingers would you have wanted watching your back in a frontier shootout? Drop their name in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the real history of the West, make sure to subscribe, because there are plenty more stories where these came from. Until next time, ride steady, shoot straight, and never sit with your back to the door.